Have you ever felt the kind of fear that seeps into your bones, gripping you in the dead of night, leaving you breathless? This story begins like that. A nightmare so vivid, it clawed its way from my dreams into the real world, refusing to release me from its shadow. My name is Elias Ashcroft, a historian and curator at an old museum, and what I'm about to share isn't just any tale. It's a journey that began as a simple dream and spiraled into something that's haunted me every day since. Imagine waking in a place you've never been, but somehow you know it down to every creaking floorboard, every shadow that flickers in the dim light. That's where my nightmare began, in a darkened hallway with walls so narrow they felt like they were pressing in, suffocating, swallowing every echo of my steps. But before we venture further into this shadowed realm, I need you to take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and stay with me till the end. Trust me, you'll want to hear every unsettling detail, because sometimes the most horrifying truths lie just beyond the veil of what we think is real. As I closed my eyes that night, I felt a strange sensation, a shiver, as if something cold and malevolent had slipped into my mind, weaving its darkness into the fabric of my subconscious. And then, without warning, I was there, standing in that endless, dimly lit hallway. A heavy silence hung in the air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, as if no living soul had breathed within those walls for centuries. The hallway stretched endlessly, lined with ancient doors, each one sealed shut, but humming with a strange energy that whispered warnings my mind couldn't understand. There was an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something waited just beyond sight, lurking, watching, biding its time. My pulse quickened, but my body felt trapped, as if my very bones were bound to that cursed corridor, helpless to turn back. The deeper I ventured, the colder it grew. Shadows clung to the walls, shifting and swaying, moving with a life of their own, like specters that had long since surrendered to the darkness. And then the whispering began, soft at first, like a breeze brushing against ancient stone, growing louder with each step. Words I couldn't understand, but that filled me with a terror so raw it felt like my soul was shrinking. I tried to look back, hoping that perhaps it was just a trick of the mind, a fleeting fear that would disappear in the morning light. But no matter how many times I blinked, forced myself to wake up, I was still there, trapped, with no escape in sight. It started on a night that should have been ordinary, a quiet evening, darkness settling beyond my window, and the usual hum of the city fading into stillness. But as I drifted into sleep, it felt as though I was being pulled, my mind yanked into a realm where nothing was quite right. In an instant, I was no longer in my bed. I was standing in a place so foreign, yet disturbingly familiar, a narrow hallway stretching endlessly in both directions, bathed in a sickly, dim yellow light that flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows on the walls. The air was thick, humid, laced with a stench that turned my stomach, a blend of old wood, damp earth, and something metallic, like rust or, worse, blood. Every breath I took was heavy, clinging to my lungs, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. As I took my first steps, a strange noise echoed down the corridor, faint but unmistakable, a faint tapping, like fingernails drumming on hollow wood, repeating in a hauntingly rhythmic pattern. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the walls and settling into my bones. I could feel it, a pulse that matched the erratic beating of my heart. My footsteps seemed louder than they should have been, crunching against a floor covered in a strange, gritty dust that felt disturbingly organic, like old ash or crumbled bone. With every step, the floor beneath my feet creaked and groaned as though it hadn't felt a living presence in centuries. Then, the whispers began, soft, sinister, barely audible, yet undeniably there, slithering into my mind like the hiss of venomous snakes. They were incomprehensible, layered voices overlapping, speaking in a language that my ears couldn't quite decipher, but that my soul felt. Each whisper seemed to burrow into my psyche, unlocking memories I hadn't known I had, fragments of places I'd never seen, and faces I couldn't remember. As I walked, my hand brushed against the walls, feeling the cold, damp texture of the decaying wood, and I noticed something. Carvings. Hundreds of tiny symbols etched deeply into the surface, spiraling and writhing like a language from a forgotten world. I felt a creeping sensation that these symbols weren't random. They were a warning, a message left behind by those who had come before me. But what were they warning me against? The farther I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to close in, pressing down on me, suffocating, as though they were alive and angry at my presence. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, I felt a strange tugging sensation, pulling me toward a door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. A faint, eerie light seeped from within, casting ghostly shadows that flickered and danced across the floor. Every instinct told me to turn back, to run, to wake up, but something stronger, a force beyond my understanding, drove me forward. As I crept closer to the door, the air grew colder, stinging my skin as if I had stepped into an Arctic wasteland. Shadows loomed along the walls, growing darker and sharper, contorting into shapes that seemed to twist and writhe like figures trapped between worlds. With each step, my breath fogged in the frigid air, forming eerie patterns that disappeared almost instantly. Inside the room beyond the door, something shifted, a sound barely louder than a whisper, but sharp enough to freeze me in place. It was a rustling, like the movement of something unnatural, something that didn't belong in this world. My pulse pounded, each beat reverberating in my ears, matching the distant, irregular tapping that seemed to stalk me through the hallway. The door creaked open wider, as if silently inviting me inside, and against every instinct, I stepped over the threshold. The room was barely illuminated, bathed in an unsettling, bluish light that seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. My gaze darted around, and that's when I noticed the impossible. Objects scattered around the room that looked disturbingly familiar. A small, weathered music box, an old photo frame, a leather-bound book with pages yellowed by age. They were items from my childhood, things I hadn't seen in decades, things that should have been miles away in a dusty attic. Not here, in this dark, cursed place. I reached out to touch the music box, feeling its cold, worn surface beneath my fingers, and as I did, the room around me shifted. The shadows thickened, moving in a slow, deliberate dance, creeping along the floor toward me like a living entity. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls, trapping me in the cold embrace of the room. I whipped around, heart racing, but the shadows continued to grow, filling the room with an almost tangible darkness. My mind screamed at me to turn away, but I was frozen, paralyzed by an overwhelming sensation of being watched, observed by something lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure, a tall, faceless silhouette that shifted in and out of focus, as though it was both there and not there at once. Its presence was oppressive, filling the room with a sense of dread so intense it was suffocating. As I stumbled backward, I felt something strange underfoot, a patch of the floor that felt softer, almost fleshy, like it was alive. I looked down, horrified, to see the wooden planks warping, twisting like sinew under my weight, pulsing in rhythm with the frantic beat of my heart. The shadows closed in tighter, crawling up the walls and ceiling, transforming the space into a vortex of darkness. Just then, I heard it again, the tapping, closer this time, echoing like a countdown to some unspeakable horror. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each tap, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. And there, in the center of the darkness, was the figure, its form barely visible, but unmistakably real, watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I felt the icy grip of terror coil around my throat, and in that moment, I knew there was no escape. The room, the shadows, the figure, they weren't just figments of a nightmare. They were alive, bound to me in a way I couldn't understand, and they wanted something. In the center of the room stood a massive, ornate mirror, its surface tarnished and cracked, casting back a distorted reflection of the dim, bluish light. Drawn to it by some inexplicable pull, I took slow, cautious steps forward, my gaze locked on the jagged edges and darkened glass that seemed to breathe, almost pulsing with an energy of its own. As I reached out, my fingertips brushing against its icy, dust-covered surface, an unbearable silence fell over the room, muting even the rhythmic tapping that had followed me all along. The room felt suffocating, as though the very walls were holding their breath, anticipating something terrible. Suddenly, the mirror's surface began to ripple like disturbed water, and my reflection twisted, warping into something grotesque and unrecognizable. Its face, my face, contorted, mouth stretching into an impossible, silent scream. The eyes were voids, deep and hollow, filled with a darkness that seemed to consume light, life, and everything it touched. I tried to pull my hand back, to tear myself away from this hideous vision, but my arm was frozen, as if rooted to the mirror itself. The reflection's mouth moved, whispering words I couldn't hear, but that filled my mind with images, flashes of forgotten memories, distorted scenes of horror, moments that felt both foreign and frighteningly familiar. As I stared into those hollow eyes, a surge of dread washed over me, and then I saw it. My own face in a reflection, smiling back, but it was wrong, twisted into something malicious and foreign. My lips were moving in the mirror, mouthing words I hadn't spoken, words that clawed at the edges of my sanity. "This is where you belong," it seemed to say, its voice echoing in my mind with a sickening familiarity. In a sudden, horrifying realization, I understood. The figure in the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a part of me, a shadow from my past or a fragment of something I'd unknowingly brought with me into this nightmare. Without warning, the room around me plunged into darkness, swallowing the light entirely, leaving me alone with the thing in the mirror. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My voice was trapped, stolen by the shadows that coiled tighter around me. Then, a cold hand reached out from the mirror, its fingers impossibly long, its touch like ice, as it wrapped around my wrist, pulling me closer, inch by inch, into the void. I struggled, every muscle tensing against a force, but my body felt weak, powerless in the grip of whatever horror was dragging me into its world. In one last desperate attempt, I shut my eyes, willing myself to wake up, to break free from the nightmare. My mind screamed for release, but when I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the room. I was back in my bed, drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding as though I'd run for miles. I wanted to believe it was over, just a nightmare that had somehow felt too real, but a lingering chill remained, a sensation that something had followed me back, something that hadn't let go. The memory of that mirror, those hollow eyes staring back at me, stayed etched in my mind, and somewhere deep inside, I knew this was far from the end. In the days that followed, the dream refused to leave me, clinging to my thoughts like a dark cloud that shadowed every waking moment. I tried to shake it off, convince myself it was nothing more than a nightmare, a twisted trick of the mind. But as each day passed, strange things began to happen. My reflection in the mirror would flicker, just for a second, out of sync with my own movements, almost as if it were watching me, studying me. I'd wake up to find faint imprints on my wrist, icy to the touch, in the exact spot where that cold hand had grasped me in the dream. Desperate for answers, I began researching anything I could find about mysterious hallways, haunted mirrors, anything that might explain the horror I'd experienced. Late one night, in a forgotten online forum buried deep within the internet, I stumbled upon a post that sent a chill down my spine. The thread was filled with stories from people all over the world, recounting eerily similar experiences: darkened hallways, endless corridors, and strange figures lurking just out of sight. But one detail caught my eye: a tale of an abandoned building not far from my city, rumored to hold an ancient, cursed mirror. Those who dared look into it spoke of nightmares bleeding into reality, whispers that followed them long after they'd left the building, a shadow that would never let them go. Driven by a sickening blend of fear and curiosity, I searched deeper, uncovering old articles about the building. It was a decaying mansion that had stood empty for decades, shrouded in rumors of disappearances and strange occurrences dating back over a century. There were photographs, grainy and faded, showing the building in its prime. A grand staircase, narrow hallways, rooms dimly lit by old gas lamps. And there, in the corner of one image, stood the mirror from my dream. Its frame was unmistakable, covered in the same intricate carvings I'd seen in my nightmare. My pulse raced, and my hands trembled as I realized that the place from my dream existed. Somehow, my mind had been there, dragged across time and space into this cursed corridor. Unable to resist, I began contacting people who'd had similar experiences. Their stories were hauntingly alike. Nightmares where they'd wandered that same darkened hallway, only to find themselves haunted by its presence even after waking. One man described how he felt watched at all hours, his reflection occasionally moving without him, mimicking expressions he hadn't made. A woman spoke of finding strange marks on her skin, bruises and scratches in shapes she couldn't explain. Each story I heard only strengthened my own fear, yet I couldn't tear myself away from the mystery. Driven to understand, I went as far as visiting the archives at the local library, hoping to find more about the building and its haunting history. There, in brittle newspapers and dusty books, I discovered old reports of people who had vanished after entering mansion, leaving only their frightened accounts behind. Some had scribbled symbols on paper, shapes that matched the carvings I'd seen on the hallway walls in my dream. There were tales of a historian in the 1800s who'd last been seen entering the mansion, murmuring about a mirror that could steal souls and trap people within its depths. Every detail of my dream seemed to match the mansion's dark past, as if my nightmare had been a warning or an invitation. The hallway, the mirror, the shadows, all were real, and I had somehow crossed into their world. I realized with a sickening dread that I had been chosen or marked, and that whatever lurked in that darkened hallway wasn't finished with me yet. Haunted by the revelations I had uncovered, I felt an uncontrollable pull toward the mansion. Every logical part of me screamed to stay away, but something darker, something primal, called me to return to that place, to confront whatever waited within its decaying walls. Late one evening, just as dusk surrendered to night, I found myself standing before the mansion's looming silhouette. The building was a shadow against the sky, its windows dark and hollow, like empty eye sockets staring back at me. A chill ran down my spine, and the silence was so absolute it felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to take the first step into its grasp. The air grew colder the moment I crossed the threshold, thick with the scent of mildew and rotting wood, mingling with something sharper, almost metallic. The faint sound of dripping water echoed through the empty halls, each drop falling like a countdown ticking closer to some unknown horror. As I walked, my footsteps seemed to awaken the mansion. The old floorboards creaked beneath me, reverberating through the empty corridors like a warning. Shadows gathered along the walls, shifting with every flicker of my flashlight, their twisted forms morphing into shapes that watched my every move, their hollow eyes following me down the hall. Just as I approached the familiar hallway from my dreams, I encountered someone unexpected, a frail, elderly woman with piercing eyes that seemed to hold years of sorrow and secrets. She introduced herself as Sarah, a former caretaker who had once lived within these walls. Her voice was a low, raspy whisper as she recounted her own chilling encounters with the mansion's sinister forces. She spoke of a night when she'd heard whispers echoing through the halls, voices that weren't hers but seemed to know her every thought. Her face darkened as she described the shadows, which, she said, were alive, entities bound to the house by a force beyond human understanding. Sarah's words were filled with a fear I couldn't ignore, but her warning only heightened my resolve. As I stepped deeper into the hallway, the walls seemed to close in around me, narrowing, twisting, until they felt suffocating, like a throat closing around its prey. The symbols I had seen in my dream were there, etched into the walls, glowing faintly in the darkness, pulsating as if they held a life of their own. The air grew thick, heavy, each breath feeling like an intrusion into forbidden ground. The shadows grew bolder, slithering along the walls, coiling around my feet as if to anchor me in place, ensuring I wouldn't escape. At the far end of the hallway, I saw it, the mirror from my dream, standing tall and ominous in the center of a small, candlelit room. Its tarnished surface seemed to vibrate, pulling at something deep within me. I was helpless, compelled to move forward, each step feeling like it was being guided by an invisible hand. I reached the doorway, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the mirror, cloaked in shadow, but unmistakably real. It was neither fully in this world nor entirely part of the next, a twisted amalgamation of human and something far more sinister. My breath caught in my throat as the figure took a step forward, crossing the boundary between the mirror and the room. Its face was hollow, an abyss where eyes should have been, and as it advanced, I felt my own body growing cold, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. Panic surged within me, and I turned to flee, but the hallway behind me had vanished, replaced by an endless stretch of shadow, trapping me within this twisted room with the figure that now hovered inches away. Its voice was a low, guttural hiss, each word dripping with malevolence, yet it spoke without sound, embedding its message directly into my mind. You were called here, bound to this place. You belong to the darkness now. In a final, desperate moment, I felt a hand grip my shoulder, a cold, familiar touch, and I knew then that I was no longer in control. The mansion had claimed me, and whatever force haunted these walls would follow me beyond them, an unseen shadow in my life, an eternal reminder that once you enter the darkness, it never truly lets you go. At the heart of the mansion, I stumbled upon a room unlike any I had seen before, a circular chamber filled with an eerie, unnatural light, as if the walls themselves were glowing with a faint, ghostly radiance. The air was thick, humming with a palpable tension that made every hair on my body stand on end. In the center of the room lay an ancient wooden chest, half buried beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. Trembling, I approached, feeling as if each step drew me deeper into a trap I could no longer escape. As I reached for the chest, I noticed an old, tarnished journal lying beside it, its cover cracked and brittle with age, bearing a strange symbol I recognized from my nightmares, the twisted, spiraling mark that seemed to connect everything I'd experienced. With shaky hands, I opened the journal, flipping through its crumbling pages. Each entry was more disturbing than the last. Accounts from people who had also been drawn into the mansion, each one recounting dreams of the darkened hallway, the mirror, and a shadowed figure that whispered secrets no living soul should ever know. They spoke of feeling haunted, pursued by something relentless, something that slipped into their lives, blurring the line between waking and sleep. The final entries were frantic, scribbled in panic handwriting, warning any who read them to stay away, to abandon any hope of breaking free once the mansion's darkness had touched them. Just then, I heard it, the rhythmic tapping from my nightmares, echoing through the walls, growing louder with each beat, as if something monstrous was approaching, its presence pushing against reality itself. The shadows in the room thickened, swirling around me, and I felt an icy breath on the back of my neck, sending a shock of terror through my veins. I turned slowly, and there, mere inches from my face, was the figure from my dream, its hollow eyes empty, yet somehow full of a malevolent intelligence. Its form was indistinct, flickering in and out of focus, as though it was shifting between worlds. It reached a hand toward me, the skin stretched thin and cold, its fingers impossibly long and sharp. Paralyzed by fear, I felt my pulse racing as the figure's grip closed around my wrist, its touch like ice searing into my skin. With a force I couldn't resist, it guided my hand toward the chest, compelling me to open it. Inside, I found a single, strange artifact, a mirror shard, dark and reflective, its surface crawling with that twisted symbol, pulsating as though it held a heartbeat. The figure leaned closer, its hollow gaze piercing into my soul, and I could feel its voice in my mind, not spoken, but embedded there, a dark, ancient command. You are bound to this place. The The darkness is within you now. Embrace it, or it will consume you. In a desperate, final act, I glanced down at the journal, where one entry seemed to stand out, almost glowing with urgency. It spoke of a choice, one final decision that could either release you from the mansion's grasp or bind you to it forever. As the shadows coiled tighter around me, I understood what it meant. I could either shatter the mirror shard and risk whatever wrath it would unleash, or I could accept it, allowing the darkness to claim me, becoming part of the mansion's twisted legacy. With trembling hands, I made my choice, raising the shard above my head. The figure's face twisted into a terrible grin, its hollow eyes widening in anticipation. And then, with every ounce of strength I could muster, I brought the shard down, shattering it into pieces. A deafening scream echoed through the room, filling my mind with a blinding, searing pain. The shadows exploded around me, dissipating like smoke, and the figure let out a wail that was both rage and despair, a sound so haunting it would follow me for the rest of my life. In an instant, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the floor of the mansion's entrance hall, alone. The air was still, the silence absolute, as though the entire place was holding its breath. I staggered to my feet, feeling the weight of what had happened, of the horror I had unleashed. But as I stumbled toward the door, I felt something heavy in my pocket. Reaching in, I found a small, unbroken shard of the mirror, cold and dark, still bearing the cursed symbol that had haunted me. As I left the mansion, I knew the darkness wasn't truly gone. It was with me now, a part of me, lurking just below the surface, waiting. And in that moment, I understood. Once touched by the darkness, it never truly lets you go. What happened after I left that cursed mansion is something I can barely recall. My memories of that night are fractured, like pieces of a broken mirror scattered across my mind. I remember staggering out, feeling a strange weight pressing down on my chest, and a cold so profound it seemed to seep into my very bones. The world outside felt wrong, distorted, as if I was seeing it through a darkened lens. The walk home was a blur, shadows lingering in every corner, watching with unseen eyes, whispering in voices only I could hear. By the time I arrived, my reflection in the glass of my front door flickered for an instant, a shadow behind my own eyes, a faint glint of something watching me from within. I awoke the next morning in a hospital bed, disoriented and confused. The doctors told me I'd been found wandering the streets, speaking incoherently about shadows, mirrors, and twisted hallways. They claimed I was in shock, maybe delirious, and that I'd be fine with some rest. But deep down, I knew better. The sense of dread that had followed me from that mansion hadn't left. In fact, it had only grown stronger, an invisible presence lurking just out of reach, clinging to me like an unwanted shadow. And then, as I lifted my hand to rub my aching temples, I noticed it. A small, dark symbol faintly etched into my skin, the same twisted mark that had haunted me in my dreams and on the walls of the mansion. Days turned to weeks, and the eerie occurrences didn't stop. The mirror in my bathroom would flicker as I walked past, my reflection seeming to lag, staring back with a depth that was no longer just mine. Objects around my home would shift, move, or disappear entirely, only to reappear in odd places, as if some unseen force was playing with me. I would wake in the middle of the night, cold and drenched in sweat, feeling an icy breath on my neck, whispers echoing from the darkened corners of my room, repeating the same words I had heard in the mansion. You are bound to us. You belong to the darkness. Everywhere I went, the symbol seemed to follow. It would appear in the most unexpected places, scrawled in the dust on my windowsill, etched faintly into the condensation on my bathroom mirror, even drawn in chalk on the sidewalk outside my home. The worst part was that no one else seemed to see it. When I showed my friends or family, they would stare at me with concern, but they couldn't see the mark. It was as if the mansion's curse was invisible to everyone but me, a haunting reminder that I was alone in this nightmare. One night, unable to bear the torment any longer, I returned to the journal I had taken from the mansion. Its pages had somehow filled with new entries, written in a handwriting that looked eerily like my own. Each entry described events I hadn't experienced yet, warnings of moments that hadn't happened but soon would. It was a chilling premonition, a prophecy of terror that seemed to tighten its grip with every passing day. The final page bore a message in bold, slanted script. The darkness lives in you now. The cycle will continue. Accept it or be consumed. I was left with one final, horrifying question. Had I ever truly left that mansion, or was some part of me still trapped within its darkened halls, bound to the mirror, forever caught between worlds? The figure's last words echoed in my mind as I closed the journal, feeling a shiver race down my spine. Embrace it, or it will consume you. I couldn't escape the feeling that the mansion wasn't just a place, but a living, breathing entity that had taken root within me, weaving itself into my very existence. To this day, the shadows follow me, appearing in unexpected places, lingering just beyond sight, waiting. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I can feel it, the cold presence watching, waiting, reminding me that the darkness is never far. And as I look into my reflection, there's always that faint flicker, a reminder that somewhere, in some twisted corner of reality, the mansion is still calling, waiting for me to return. So I leave you with this question. What if the nightmares we leave behind aren't really gone? What if they linger, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what they once held? If you feel something following you, a shadow that lingers just out of sight, be careful. You might find, as I did, that the darkness is closer than you think. If this story has unsettled you, if you, too, feel that cold chill creeping down your spine, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who dares to know the truth, and let us know. Have you ever been haunted by a nightmare that refused to end? Because sometimes, the darkest hallways aren't the ones we walk through, they're the ones we carry within us.